The ladder descended into complete darkness. He could hear the liquid moving below him, thick and slow, and the smell rose up to meet him like a physical wall. It was not just the smell of waste. It was sharper than that, more chemical, mixed with rot, and something sweet that made his stomach turn. His feet touched the bottom and sank 6 inches into the muck. The ceiling was so low he had to crouch. Water dripped from above, cold and foul, running down his neck and soaking into his shirt. He had a wooden shovel in one hand and an empty barrel strapped to his back. The work would take all night. By morning, he would have cleared maybe half of what had accumulated down here over the past month, and tomorrow night he would come back and do it again. No one above ground wanted to think about where their waste went. No one wanted to imagine the space beneath their kitchens and their bedrooms. But someone had to go down there. Someone had to stand in the filth and shovel it out, bucket by bucket, barrel by barrel, until the pit was empty enough to use again. This was London in the late 14th century, a city of nearly 50,000 people crammed inside ancient walls that had been built for half that number. The streets were narrow and crooked, lined with wooden buildings that leaned so close together their upper floors almost touched. There was no running water. There were no sewers in the modern sense. Every household, every shop, every inn had a cesspit dug beneath or behind the building. These pits collected everything: human waste, kitchen scraps, animal blood from butchering, dirty water from washing. The pits were supposed to be lined with stone or brick to keep the contents from seeping into the soil, but most were just holes in the ground, and they leaked constantly. The smell in medieval London was overwhelming. It hung over the city like fog, strongest in summer when the heat made everything worse. Waste seeped into wells. It ran through the streets when the pits overflowed. Disease spread in ways people did not understand but could not escape: typhoid, dysentery, cholera. The death rate was brutal, especially among children. But the city kept growing, and the more people there were, the more waste they produced. The pits filled faster than they could be emptied, and someone had to empty them. His name was Edmund Raker, and he was 31 years old when he started working as a gong farmer. That was what they called men who cleaned cesspits. The term came from the old word for a privy: gong farmer, night soil man, dung collector. There were many names, all of them polite ways to avoid saying what the job actually involved. Edmund had not wanted this work. No one wanted this work. But he had few choices. He had been a laborer on a manor estate outside the city, working the fields during harvest season and doing odd jobs the rest of the year. Then the landowner died, and the new lord brought in his own men. Edmund was let go with no warning and no compensation. He came to London because he heard there was work in the city, any kind of work, if you were willing to take it. He found a room in a boarding house near Cheapside and spent weeks looking for employment. He tried the docks, he tried the markets, he tried the guilds, but he had no connections and no particular skills, and the city was full of men just like him, desperate and hungry, and willing to work for almost nothing. Then one evening a man approached him in a tavern. The man said the city needed gong farmers. The pay was better than most laboring jobs. 4 pence a night, which was enough to live on if you were careful. Edmund asked what the work involved, and the man told him plainly, "You go down into the cesspits after dark and shovel out the waste. You load it into barrels and haul it out to the river or to collection points outside the walls. You work alone or with one partner. You work at night because the smell is too offensive during the day when people are trying to conduct business." Edmund felt his throat tighten, but he did not say no. He had 6 pence left to his name and no other prospects. He told the man he would start the next night. The work began after sunset. The city had regulations about when cesspits could be emptied. It had to be done at night to avoid disturbing the public. Edmund met his partner, a man named John, who had been doing this work for 2 years and rarely spoke. They carried their tools through the dark streets to the first job of the night, a large inn near Bishopsgate. The innkeeper led them around to the back where a wooden cover marked the entrance to the pit. John lifted the cover, and the smell hit them immediately, thick and choking. Edmund gagged, but John did not react. John went down the ladder first, lowering himself into the darkness with the ease of long practice. Edmund followed, his hands shaking on the rungs. The pit was 8 feet deep and circular, maybe 6 feet across. The waste came up to their knees. It was semi-solid, a mixture of human excrement, urine, food waste, and other things Edmund could not identify in the darkness. They worked by the light of a single lantern hung on a hook near the entrance. John used a wooden shovel to scoop the waste into a bucket. When the bucket was full, he passed it up to Edmund, who emptied it into a barrel at ground level. Then he lowered the bucket back down and John filled it again. They did this for hours. The smell was so strong Edmund could taste it. It coated his throat and his tongue. His clothes were soaked. His boots filled with liquid filth that squelched with every step. His arms burned from the repetitive lifting. His back ached from crouching in the low space, and the work was never finished. Even after they had removed 20 barrels of waste, the pit was still half full. They would have to come back the next night to finish. Within a week, Edmund understood what this job would cost him. The smell never left. He washed his clothes in the river, but the stench remained, soaked into the fabric. He scrubbed his skin until it was raw, but he could still smell it on himself. Other people noticed immediately. When he walked into a shop, customers moved away. When he sat down in a tavern, the men at the next table got up and left. His landlady told him he could no longer use the common room. She made him enter through a back door and forbade him from speaking to the other tenants. Children pointed at him in the street and held their noses. Women pulled their skirts aside when he passed. Within a month, he stopped trying to interact with anyone. He bought his food from street vendors who served him quickly and without speaking. He ate alone. He slept alone. He spent his days in his small room waiting for night to fall so he could go back to work. The isolation was total. He was surrounded by thousands of people, but he might as well have been invisible. Worse than invisible. He was something people looked at with disgust, something they wanted to forget existed. And slowly, he began to feel like he was not quite human anymore. He was the thing that lived in the filth, the thing that touched what no one else would touch. His sense of himself started to dissolve. He stopped remembering what it felt like to be treated with basic dignity. If you had no money, no family, and no other way to survive, could you do this work? Could you go down into a pit of human waste every night knowing that everyone in the city would despise you for it? How long would it take before you started to believe you deserved their disgust? The danger was constant and unpredictable. The cesspits were not just filled with waste. They contained methane gas that built up from decomposition, invisible and deadly. If the concentration was high enough, a single spark from a lantern could cause an explosion. More often, the gas simply displaced the oxygen in the pit. Men descended ladders and passed out within seconds, drowning in the filth before anyone could pull them out. Edmund had heard the stories. A gong farmer named Peter, who collapsed in a pit behind a brewery and died before his partner could reach him. 2 brothers who went down together and both suffocated, found the next morning by the property owner. The gas had no smell of its own, so there was no warning. You simply stopped breathing. The city kept no official count of how many gong farmers died this way, but everyone in the trade knew the risks. Edmund started to hesitate at the top of every ladder, his heart pounding, wondering if this would be the pit that killed him. One night, in late summer, he went down into a cesspit behind a row of tenements. The space was tighter than usual, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He had filled 3 buckets when his vision started to blur. His head felt light. His legs weakened. He dropped the shovel and tried to climb back up the ladder, but his hands would not grip the rungs properly. He called out to John, who was waiting above, and John reached down and grabbed his arm, hauling him up with strength born from panic. Edmund lay on the ground gasping, his lungs burning. Another few seconds and he would have been dead. John said nothing. They moved to the next job. But here is something most people never knew about gong farmers. They were protected by law in a way almost no other laborers were, because the work was so necessary and so few men would do it. The city granted them unusual privileges. They could demand payment up front before starting a job. Property owners could not refuse to pay them, and the rates were set by regulation, which meant no one could undercut their wages. In an era when most workers had no protections at all, when laborers could be cheated or dismissed without recourse, gong farmers had legal guarantees. They also had a strange kind of immunity from certain social rules. They could walk through the city at night when most people were forbidden to be out. They could enter private property without permission to access cesspits. And despite the universal disgust they inspired, they were never arrested or harassed by city authorities. Everyone knew they were essential. Everyone knew that without them, the city would drown in its own waste within weeks. So society granted them just enough status to keep them working, even while treating them as subhuman in every other way. Think about that for a moment. The people who kept medieval cities from collapsing into disease and filth were given legal protections that most workers could only dream of. But they were still treated like they were worth less than nothing. Does that seem like a fair trade? Would you take legal rights over basic human respect? Which one matters more? Most men who became gong farmers did not last more than a few years. The work destroyed their bodies. Constant exposure to waste led to infections that never fully healed. Cuts and scrapes on their hands and arms became ulcerated. Respiratory problems developed from breathing the fumes night after night. Many developed chronic coughs that turned into consumption. Their backs gave out from the endless lifting and carrying. And the mental strain was just as destructive. The isolation broke men down in ways that were hard to see, but impossible to ignore. They stopped caring about their appearance. They stopped speaking in complete sentences. Some drank themselves into oblivion. Others simply walked away one day and were never seen again. The city always needed gong farmers, so there was always another desperate man willing to take the place of the one who left. Edmund watched men come and go. He saw them arrive full of determination, convinced they could handle it, and he saw them leave broken and hollow a few months later. He wondered when his turn would come. He wondered what it would take to break him completely. Edmund lasted 3 years and 4 months. Longer than most, but not long enough to grow old in the trade. The end came on a cold night in early spring. He was working in a cesspit beneath a merchant's house near the river. The pit was deeper than usual, nearly 10 feet, and the waste had hardened at the bottom into a thick crust that was difficult to break apart. He was alone that night because John had been too sick to work. Edmund climbed down with his shovel and lantern and began the slow process of loosening the compacted waste. He worked for over an hour, making progress, filling bucket after bucket. Then the wall of the pit gave way. The lining had been poorly constructed, and the constant moisture had weakened it. Loose soil and debris poured into the space, knocking Edmund off his feet. He fell backward into the waste, and the debris kept coming, burying his legs, then his waist. He tried to push himself up, but there was nothing solid to grip. He shouted for help, but there was no one nearby to hear. The weight of the soil pressed down on his chest. He could not breathe properly. He struggled for several minutes, exhausting himself, sinking deeper. By the time a night watchman heard his cries and found him, Edmund was unconscious, half buried in a mixture of soil and sewage. They pulled him out and carried him to a charity hospital. He survived, but his lungs were damaged. He coughed blood for weeks. The physician said he would never be able to do heavy labor again. Edmund was 34 years old, and he was finished. The medical advances that came centuries later, the understanding of sanitation and disease, the development of proper sewage systems, all of it began with the recognition that human waste had to be managed. Medieval cities were testing grounds for what would eventually become public health policy. The men who cleaned the cesspits, who removed the waste that would otherwise have poisoned entire neighborhoods, were doing work that had to be done for society to function. They were not heroes. They were not celebrated, but they kept the city alive. Every person who lived in medieval London benefited from their labor. Every merchant who conducted business, every family that slept in a clean bed, every child who played in the streets, all of them depended on men like Edmund going down into the pits at night and removing what no one else wanted to see. The cost was measured in ruined bodies and shattered lives. The cost was measured in men who died choking on methane, or drowning in filth, or simply giving up because they could not bear the isolation anymore. Edmund survived his accident, but he never recovered. He lived for 2 more years, doing small jobs that did not require much strength, sleeping in doorways when he could not afford a room. He died of pneumonia in a charity ward, forgotten by everyone except the few other Gong farmers who had known him. The city did not record his death. It had no reason to. There were always more men waiting to take his place. But Edmund was not unique. In every major city across medieval Europe, there were men doing the same work. Paris had its night soil collectors. Rome had its cloaca cleaners. In German cities, they were called latrine emptiers. The names changed, but the work remained the same. Men descended into pits of waste because cities produced waste faster than it could decompose naturally, and this work continued for centuries. Even after the medieval period ended, even after the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, cities still needed men to clean cesspits. London had Gong farmers well into the 19th century, long after people liked to think they had become civilized and modern. The work only disappeared when underground sewer systems were finally built, and even then, someone still had to go down into those sewers to maintain them. The job never truly ended. It just changed shape, and the people who did it remained invisible, despised, and essential. That pattern has never really been broken. Right now, there are people doing work that keeps modern society functioning. Work that you benefit from every single day, and you probably do not know their names, or think about what their lives are like. Maybe that is the real legacy of men like Edmund. Not that they suffered, but that we needed them to suffer, and we convinced ourselves it was acceptable because we did not have to see it.